Welcome back to Red Horn Society. And today I wanted to go over with y'all traditional aiming techniques. There's a lot of folks nowadays that are getting into traditional archery, which is absolutely wonderful, but they don't have a really good guideline to start. They might start getting their right hand technique down to their left hand technique, but as far as putting the arrow on target, they're a little in the dark. So I'm going to try to help shed some light on that today. Now, first thing you have to establish, and you can also play around with it, but ultimately, before becoming a proficient traditional shooter, you do need to pick an anchor point. And when I say an anchor point, because at the end of the day, your anchor point is going to have a dramatic impact on the type of the aiming technique that you use to achieve maximum results. So for starters, most folks tend to either go with 3 fingers underneath or split finger. However, the anchor point in which you utilize is ultimately going to make a dramatic effect on the aiming technique that's most useful for you and to give you maximum results. Myself personally, I've always liked to use 3 fingers up, 3 fingers underneath, drawn very high on the cheekbone, something like this. Obviously with my bow canted, any traditional shooter that's not using pins, that's just using an instinctive basis, is always going to cant the bow to some degree. Some folks will cant the bow a little bit more aggressive than others. I've heard a lot of people say that you need to cant the bow 45 degrees. It's all feel. It just depends on what you feel comfortable with. Straight up and down is not a technique. However, 15, 30, 45, whichever gives you the maximum results and makes you feel most comfortable. So with that being said, I shoot 3 fingers underneath, drawn very high on the cheekbone. Some folks like to draw 3 fingers underneath with the pointer finger touching the corner of the mouth. Some people like to shoot split finger with the middle finger touching the corner of the mouth, and so on and so forth. So play around with the particular anchor point that you'd like to use best. And like I said, play around with it. What works good for me might not work well for you. And that's another thing that's very beautiful about traditional archery. Now, with that being said, the first thing I want to move into is true instinctive shooting. I'm not a true instinctive shooter. And Byron Ferguson defines it in his book, Becoming the Arrow, that the only real instinctive shot that you will ever take in any form of traditional archery is the very first time you ever shoot a bow without sights on it. Now, Byron Ferguson's a very accomplished archer, so I don't want to dismiss anything that he might say. However, it's all difference in opinions and matters that mean most to you, so I'm going to go over my interpretation of true instinctive shooting. Here I've gone and drawn a chart of a makeshift bow with knock points, limbs, riser, and sight window. I've indicated this blue dot as what I would call my arrow shaft. So if you're looking at this diagram in a real sense, essentially what you're going to be looking at is the limbs, the sight window, the shaft indicated by the blue dot, and the green circle with the X through it being your target area. So with a true instinctive shooter, though it's not anything I've ever tampered with because I'm not a true instinctive shooter, means that at the point they take aim, they are focusing so hard on the target area that all they see is a target area. They've pinpointed a very small region. Even a true instinctive shooter isn't going to try to put the arrow in somewhere in this circle. They're going to pick out a specific spot inside this circle and attempt to put their arrow in. So they're going to concentrate so hard on that particular area that all this is going to vanish and all their focus is going to be is that point. It's said that a true instinctive shooter, at the time they release the arrow to the time the arrow impacts their intended target area, they remember nothing of the shot because their focus and their intention was that great on their target area. So basically, to become a true instinctive shooter, you have to shoot thousands and thousands and thousands of arrows in some people's degree or opinion, due to the fact that it's merely utilized off of muscle memory. And the research that I've done on actual muscle memory says that you have to perform an action at least 4,000 to 5,000 times before your muscles actually have a true muscle memory to where that's going to be the same result every time. So it takes a great deal of practice and a great deal of skill to become a true instinctive shooter. Moving on from instinctive shooting, I'll explain to you what I utilize. I utilize what's known as, or at least defined as, split vision shooting. So when I'm looking down my sight window of my bow, when I start to take aim, I see the limbs, I see the arrow shaft, and I see the target. And at that point, I guess you would somewhat consider it a gap shot, though I don't define it as gap shooting. However, I define it more as a feel-good shooting. So for me, when I shoot with my high anchor point, high on the cheekbone, looking down the shaft of the arrow, essentially what I'm doing is I'm using the shaft of my arrow for my windage. When I look down it, I'm using my sight or my arrow shaft to establish my windage. I have very, very, very little problems making sure all my arrows are on a center point. If I sit back and I shoot 3 arrows, one from 10, one from 20, and one from 30, though the elevation might waver to a small degree, the windage is pinpoint accuracy. And that's something that I take a great deal of pride in. So that being said, I'm using the shaft of the arrow somewhat to sight down, but mostly to adjust my windage. However, I'm using my split vision sighting technique to establish a feel good. So when I'm looking down the side of my arrow, I know, because I've shot so many arrows using my technique, that the arrow shaft dead on the target is dead on for me at 20 yards. Period. With my 60-pound recurve, it is dead on at 20 yards. I know if, say for instance, and I'm going to use another diagram, say this is my intended target, and this is my arrow shaft at 20. That's dead on. At 10, I'm going to be somewhere up here. I'm actually going to sight above my intended target to some degree. And at 30, I'm going to be somewhere around here. At 40, I'm going to be somewhere around here. And permitting, though I would never do it in a hunting situation, at 50, I'd be somewhere around here. Now, that works well for me. And it might not work well for others. I've not spoken with enough people to know whether or not that technique is something that's well adapted around the world, or if it's something that I might use exclusively. However, it's my technique. The third is going to be gap shooting. A lot of people gap shoot. So with a gap shooter, what they're going to do through process of many times of practicing and things of that nature is they're going to know exactly how far. And now let me define gap shooting versus split vision shooting. When I shoot with my technique that I was just demonstrating, being at 20 yards, 30 yards, and 10 yards, and so on and so forth, I'm not looking for a mechanical way or a mathematical way to judge my distance through gap shooting. I focus very hard on my intended target, though at particular distances, I know a general area of where I need to be placing the tip of my arrow. However, it still feels good. I let my subconscious body take over and help to aim as well. But it's more of an educated aiming as opposed to a true instinctive aiming. Now, with a gap shooter, a true gap shooter, and there's multiple techniques, and I'm going to go over that as well, but a true gap shooter is going to use some way or another to align. Say my finger indicates the target area, the tip of my finger. He's going to use some way to use that tip of his arrow or that shaft to gap the distance between here and here to know how he needs to place his arrow to achieve maximum results. So if this is the arrow and I'm sighting down it, and here's my target area, at 30 yards I might need to be here, or at 30 yards I might need to be here, so on and so forth. But he shot so many times, he feels comfortable in his gapping technique. Now, one way might be to mathematically judge how far he needs to have the tip of his arrow, being 10, 20, 30, 40, and he's just committed that to memory, to where when he takes sight down his arrow, he has a good calculated memory of how far that gap needs to be from the point of his arrow to his intended target. Now, another technique in gap shooting is going to be shaft space. So what that gentleman might do at the same time is he's looking down his arrow at that particular target, and he says, all right, my shaft diameter is X amount. So if I'm shooting at 30 yards, I need to use 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 shaft diameters for the arrow shaft that he's using to make that more achievable. Or say it's 20. He'll say the same thing for 20. And I'm just using this as a general, as a display model, as opposed to a rule of thumb or absolute. I don't know how. I think it would all change and vary due to anchor point and the way that you actually sight down the arrow, and also poundage. You know, if you shoot a heavier pound bow, chances are that arrow might shoot a little flatter, just due to the reasoning that bow stores more energy, and your arrow has somewhat of a greater arrow speed, so it's more inclined to shoot flatter. Now, another technique that a gentleman might use is actually pinpointing areas on his bow as a form of sights. Not so much gap shooting, though I guess it would be a form of gap shooting, but what they would do was they would shoot so many times that they would say, okay, the top of my striker plate is going to be 10 yards, double the striker plate is going to be 20 yards, triple the striker plate is going to be 30 yards, and so on and so forth. Or they might just pick areas on the bow that they've found results from. So when they aim it down that particular area, they know I'm dead nuts at that area on my bow when I'm shooting it. So say this was a striker pad here. Say it's a larger striker pad. You see some of the striker pads on the market that are really tall, and they actually have grooves cut in them. And they might use those grooves to sight 10 yards, 20 yards, 30 yards. Though I think it would be a little bit more. I think it would be the scale for that would be a little higher. This one might be 10 yards. The top of it may be 20. The actual cutout for your sight window might be 30. And they utilize that, and then, you know, the next distance up, say this was 35, well, now they feel confident. That's dead on the money. So these are some other techniques that you can use as well. However, I've always used split vision. It's worked well for me. But try out all these different techniques. You might be surprised on how all of them might work for you in a different way. I've even heard of some fellas that use multiple techniques in different situations. I use the same technique for every situation, no matter what. But I've heard some guys will do a gap system if it's 20 yards or less. Or I'm sorry, they'll do more of an instinctive system if it's 20 yards or less. And they'll use a gap system if it's 20 yards and out. And yet again, that just boils down to shooting your bow a lot. Practice makes perfect. Perfect makes money. So get out in the backyard, go to your arrow range, fling some arrows down range, and find out which one of these techniques works best for you. Give us feedback on this topic. We really appreciate all the support that we've had thus far. Like our Facebook page and like our YouTube channel as well. And stay tuned for the Red Horn Society website that's going to be launching here before long. Once again, from Red Horn Society, we want to say thank y'all so much. Red Horn Society, out.